So I'm Ali Fazel. I am born in Kenya. I moved to Britain when I was 10. My family and we lived in Birmingham. I now live in London. I work as a consultant in the city. And yeah, sort of Britain is home, but Kenya is home too. I'm the youngest of my family. I've got nieces and nephews. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. So when I think back to my childhood in Mombasa, it was just idyllic. Like honestly, just the most beautiful upbringing in the most idyllic, part of Mombasa. We would sort of spend. I remember Sunday evenings always comes to mind when people ask me about my childhood, because I remember sort of slow evenings just by the beach sometimes, or we used to live like a stone's throw away from the cliffs, and so we'd go there. Sometimes it was Lighthouse where we'd sort of do rounds around. Then we'd have biryani for lunch every Sunday, and everyone would take a nap. And then we would all meet downstairs at 5 p.m. to play cricket. And my cousins would come, and my dad would wake up from his nap and come down. And I was eagerly waiting because I'd been playing outside all day. And then we'd play cricket up until sunset. And yeah, it was just, I think of memories like that, or, going to the beach on the weekends. My childhood was so outdoorsy. I spent almost every minute that I could playing outside, or going to play tennis at the sports club where we had family friends, and we'd all meet and sit and mingle together. It didn't matter who you were or where you came from. And yeah, I think back to school as well, which was amazing. Often people think that, oh, you're from Kenya, so what was school like there? Almost like concerned about my education standards, especially when I first moved to this country. But actually, it was an amazing school. It was the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa, which was opened sort of mid-2000s. And probably, that was really formative for me, those first few years there. So yeah, I was lucky enough to spend the first 12 years of my life in Mombasa. And then we moved to Britain. And I think it was always the plan that we would move to the West at some point. I think, I had family in Canada, but also in Britain. And I think mum and dad eventually decided that Britain was the place to be, because my brother and sister had both gone away for university. And it was so hard to split apart the family. I think they were really keen that we all moved together so that we could carry on living together as a family. And, there was business interest in Britain as well. So it made sense to make that move together. Or else, I think they thought maybe they'll be empty nesters forever, as opposed to building a life together in Britain. So, yeah.
When did you come to Britain?
When I was 12, that was in 2011. Yeah.
Yeah. Just want to go back a little bit to your parents and your grandparents.
Yeah.
Do you know how your parents ended up in Africa?
Yes. So my mum and dad were both born in Africa. Mm-hmm. My mum was born in Kampala in Uganda, and my dad was born in Mombasa. My grandparents were also born in Africa, and it was their parents. So on my mum's side, it was my great-grandfather who moved. On my dad's side, it was my great-great-grandfather who moved. So we had been in Africa for at least 3 to 4 generations. So on my dad's side, it was, my great-great-grandfather who moved. On my mum's side, my great-grandfather, and his story was actually really interesting, because he was I think he was one of the most successful coffee traders of his time when he was there. And this was obviously during colonial Britain, right? And his name was Rashid Molidina, and he was extremely enterprising. He moved from India, I think it was like 30s or so, 1930s, maybe earlier. I don't know the exact dates. And you know how this community is hugely enterprising. Everyone wants to start their own business. No one is happy to work for anyone else. So he was keen to start his own coffee trade. So he was based in, he first arrived in Tanzania, but then moved to Kenya. But he would have to travel to Uganda every week for the coffee auctions. So he would go to Uganda for these coffee auctions with his translator, because he didn't speak English. But these auction houses were full of white British men, and he would have to sit at the back behind the auction sort of area with his translator, who would then bid for him for the coffee. And he was doing this for ages, going to Uganda back and forth. until eventually decided that actually something's got to change. Now, at that point, the coffee auctions actually moved to Nairobi, so it made life a lot easier for him because he didn't have to travel to Uganda every week. And it was at one auction where actually there was a coffee going, and he outbid everyone else in the room and overinflated the price by around over 10 times the actual price of the coffee. And in that moment, the stories I've heard is, everyone in the auction house was like, who the hell is this man who has bid, so much higher than anyone else? And they all looked back, and it was Rashid Molidina, who had overbid, and the auctioneer came to the back and, shook his hand and brought him to the front. And that was the start. But I think it really just shows the resilience that this community had right from the offset. So that was my maternal side. And then on my paternal side, my grandfather, he was the first tea exporter to Pakistan from Kenya. And today, Pakistan is the second largest importer of Kenyan tea after Britain. So yeah, on both sides, there's stories of enterprise, tea, coffee, families who've made the best of their lives in Africa, coming from India, hugely adaptable. And so we've always been very strongly African because of that. We've been in Africa for such a long time. We speak Swahili. We love the country. It has given us so much as a community and as a family that it was quite hard to leave, to be honest, in many ways.
Did your parents or grandparents, you must have heard stories of their struggles settling in Africa?
Yeah, absolutely. It was tough. I think one thing about this community, however, and I spoke about this a little bit in my dissertation as well, is there was a tendency to talk less about the struggle, almost to suppress it, because of, I don't know if it was a shame or if it was almost they saw it as unhelpful to talk about, but it would take a lot, and almost I think it's only in the more recent years that we've started to talk a bit more about it. And I think it's only the generations that have followed who have got that awareness, who feel like it's important to talk about it. But the generations before were very happy, I think, to suppress it because they didn't see it as a helpful conversation to have. A lot of them were in survival mode, right, when they first moved to Africa, I guess. Similarly, many who moved from Uganda to here were in survival mode. They just had to make the best of the life they'd given because a lot of them didn't have the option to go back. So they had to just, get on with it. And talking about racism and stuff like that, they didn't really feel comfortable. But of course they did. I sadly wasn't lucky enough to meet any of my grandfathers because they both passed away before I was born. But through my grandmothers, I often heard about, how tough it was. For example, with my great-grandfather and having to make a name for himself in the industry, which was British, which meant he couldn't even sit in the auction house with the rest of the people who were basically bidding for the same coffee. It does hit a nerve, sort of. It does really make you think that that's something we wouldn't even fathom today as being an issue, but they still were so successful in a time that was so, everything was pitted against them so much.
Do you know, Anata, you said it before, why did your grandparents leave India?
Yeah. So so I know that there was people moving for the railways. They didn't move for the railways. I think they moved just after that initial influx of people left. So they weren't part of that group who moved, but I think it was purely enterprise. I know my great grandfather on my my great grandfather on my dad's side. Yeah, and I only know this now because I went to India to find out. He was in Gujarat, he was in Kutch, and it was his son who decided actually to go to Kenya. He had a shop in Kutch, and I actually saw the shop when I went recently. It was on the corner opposite the masjid. And in Kera, which is not far from Bhuj, yeah, fairly close. Little village shop, and he decided to actually move to East Africa, and he moved back and forth because his family was still in India. But it was purely for enterprise. It was purely for making a better life for themselves. I think at the time there was quite a few people going anyway, and there was good things coming out from Africa. You know, there was a lot of positive talk. There seemed to be momentum behind it. And so he moved, but his family was still back, so he was back and forth. But his son then firmly, you know, remained in Africa, and that was the start of it really for us.
You were very young in Kenya,
Yeah.
10-year-old, so at that time probably you might not have asked yourself, am I Indian or
Yeah.
am I African?
Yeah, I didn't. I never did ask myself that question at that point. I think I knew I was East African Indian, and I only really began to think about that when we started talking about moving to Britain. And you know, when we moved here, it was sort of like, whoa, okay, now this is a hugely different environment. You know, although we were minorities in Kenya, we were minorities in a very different sense to being a minority in Britain. Being a minority here is, you know, there's a slight sense of apprehension. You know, you're new. It's sort of like, oh, okay, I'm new here. I don't feel very culturally in tune. You know, I'm talking about when I first moved here. Whereas in Kenya, you've almost got this privilege of being a minority because, you know, unfortunately, the way that things were set up in colonial Kenya is that the Asians were very much in, you know, the middle, right? They were put above the local community of the black community, and then they were beneath the whites. And I think it worked for them, so they let it happen. And that sort of perception never left, even after the British left. And, you know, you'll know that. And so we had this privilege almost of being Indian, and, you know, it was sort of, and unfortunately, I think it was inbuilt into the way, you know, brown people there and Indian people there live their lives. So when you came here as Indians, I think at that point we really started to think, okay, now this is the minority experience, where you've got to adjust to the culture a bit more. You know, we didn't really do much of that in Africa, I think, and it's a shame looking back. I think there's so much more we could have done to be more accommodating.
How was the relationship when you were young?
Yeah.
In Mombasa, between the different communities, were you together in schools?
Yeah. So I'll start at home. At home, of course, it was more like an extended family. You know, I say this, but we were hugely connected to our house help and our community at home. We had, you know, as many sort of families do in Africa, you have, you know, house help, and we had that. And one of them, her name is Zaytuni. I call her Nuni. She's like a second mum to me. I was on FaceTime to her yesterday, you know, and she only speaks Swahili, and, you know, we still communicate in Swahili. And she was there. She was employed but just before I was born, specifically to be sort of around to support my mum with me. And up until the day we left, she was part of the family. She genuinely is like a second mother. And you know, when we left, it was so painful. That was probably the hardest goodbye I had, and I still remember it. And to this day, actually, she's still carried on working with the family because of that close connection we've built. So within the family environment, it was an extended family. Of course, there was, you know, you think back now and you do think, God, we were so immune to this whole. There was obviously a hierarchy, right? Because it was house help and you know, family and stuff, and it still does feel slightly uncomfortable looking at it back now. But actually, they were so tightly knit, and, you know, there was such a core part of our experience and our lives there that we wouldn't be able to do without them. At school, it was slightly different, and I think because in school, so I went to the Aga Khan Academy in Mombasa, and you know, you had a real eclectic mix of people. You had sort of expats who had moved and they lived in Kenya as well, and they sent their children there. You had Indians, you had Ismailis, Ithnashris, you had Hindus, Muslims, all sorts. They were there, and then you also had black children there. So you had a real mix, but you would find that sort of grouping that would happen. You know, with all the Indian parents, with all the Indian kids, our parents all knew each other. They'd meet up on the weekends, and so it you know, created that dynamic. Having said that, though, between the Indian kids, there was no real barriers at all, regardless of, you know, were you Hindu, Muslim, you know, Christian. It really didn't matter. There was just, we were all so attuned culturally that it didn't really matter what your background was from that point of view. Of course, we all, you know, we all integrated and mixed and mingled as you do as kids in school. But as I think people grew older, you know, that you would get those sort of differences, and that would begin to develop slightly more with communities and that kind of thing. But yeah, a really eclectic mix. And I think as well, because of the nature of the school, we had teachers coming from Britain, we had teachers coming from the US. So that really impacted the way that, you know, we saw school. And I feel really privileged to have been able to go to that school as opposed to any other school in Mombasa, because I just feel it gave you such an incredible view of the world that was so international, so, you know, outward looking, which is which in a small town like Mombasa is quite hard to get, actually. So I feel really lucky, actually, to have had that opportunity. Yeah.
Talking about your experience, can you tell us something about the languages? You already mentioned Swahili.
Yeah.
The other languages.
Yeah, so obviously English was, we always spoke English at home. But we're Gujarati Kachis, so we speak Kachi and Gujarati. So there's always a joke that Kachis will speak Gujarati, but Gujaratis won't try and speak Kachi, right? Even though we are from Kutch, so we are from Gujarat ourselves. So Kutch is obviously a district within Gujarat, so it makes sense. So we spoke Kachi. I spoke Kachi with my grandparents and my grandmothers, but with my parents, we spoke English. With the house help, we always spoke Swahili, and with locals when we were out, we'd speak Swahili. So there was it's quite a dynamic mix, right? Because you learn to switch between languages quite quickly, you know. And funnily enough, I'm sure other people will have said similar, is you get this hybrid of languages eventually, and even up until this day, you know, our Gujarati has Swahili words mixed into it. Our English will have some Kutchi and Gujarati words mixed into it that we sort of just started to throw around, and people start to pick up things like, you know, sufuria in the kitchen, you know, means pot, but that's used across all three languages, I think. So yeah, so quite a few, actually, yeah.
Food is also something.
Yeah, food is incredible. I think it tells such an amazing story, the food, doesn't it? Especially, and of course I say this because of my experience of, you know, food in my childhood in Mombasa, but I think back now, and, you know, it's little things like, there's, for example, one of the main dishes in Mombasa, Swahili dish now, is lamb pilau, right? And you go to Old Town in Mombasa, and you can sit on the seafront and order in Old Town, you know, some amazing lamb pilau, which is made by the Arabs there. But of course, that's got huge Indian influences. You know, it's an Indian dish primarily, but it's got such deep Swahili roots now as well, because it's got Swahili flavors. And a lot of these foods will have like a coastal twist almost. You know, the biryani is sweeter. You know, you can always taste that slight difference. The masala is different to, say, a Pakistani biryani or an Indian biryani. You know, mahambris, for example, some people call them mandazi. You know, we still make them at home. My mum still makes them. You know, they're like a sweet bread, right? And some people, you know, I'll have Indian friends who'll say, you know, what is this? But we'll have it with curries as well, which is this sweet bread, but we have it with curries. The favorite one is kukupaka, which is a coconut chickeny sort of dish. It's got like coconut milk base, but it's a spicy chicken kind of mix, and you have it with mahambri, which is a sweet bread. And, you know, or ugali, for example, which we'll now have with Indian curries as well, which is, you know, maize flour mixed in with water. So there's such a dynamic mix of flavors and stories and, you know, cultural backgrounds that the food sort of allows us to tell. It really is incredible. And we take it for granted. But I think when I speak to friends who are not from the background about it, it really puts into perspective how cool this story actually is, and how many different parts to it there are, and the triality of these identities, you know, being Indian, British, Kenyan, it really comes out. We love a roast too now. You know, Christmas, we'll go all out with a roast dinner. That one we haven't done any fusions with so far. We've tried to keep it pure and not influence it too much. But yeah.
Just another question in this direction is music and dance.
Yeah. It's so interesting with that. It's so funny because, you know, although when we were in Kenya, and I think this is also part of that whole colonial history, there's such a large part of us that really looks up to Britain. You know, we grew up thinking, oh, London and Britain and, you know, the UK and that sort of thing, and we looked at it with such awe and admiration. And so I think we would always try as kids to stay up to date with, you know, Western music and, you know, things like that. And I think maybe my experience of music is slightly less cultural because I grew up with older siblings who were listening to Chris Brown and, you know, Lady Gaga and this sort of thing. But of course, on long car journeys, I remember from Mombasa to Nairobi, we would drive there once a year or so, you know, and we'd stop over, and that journey would be full of Bollywood music, you know, playing the whole time. Like many, you know, Indian British kids these days, you've got this mix of Bollywood, English music, and also I think, especially after my trip to India, I've grown a huge affinity for sort of Indian classical, but also of like Qawwali music, you know, and the rich histories there. And we would stop in this one Sufi shrine on the way from Mombasa to Nairobi. There's a shrine, I can't remember what it's called, and you would get, you know, I still think back to now, you'd have the smell of, I don't know what the word is in English, but agarbatti, sort of the scent of it, and they would be playing qawwalis on the way there, and there's so much to it, I think, but yeah, I suppose that's probably...
You know, all these influences of your childhood, Indian as well as African, so when you came to Britain, did you feel confused?
You know, I think when I first came to Britain, I was only 11, 12 or so. So you don't really think about your identity too much at that age. You know, you're sort of just a kid. And, you know, I didn't really think too much about moving to Britain. I'm almost quite pleased that I was quite young because, you know, the older you get, the more these things impact you. And now I think back to my parents who had lived in Kenya for decades and then moved to Britain. That must have been incredibly difficult. And I remember you know, sometimes it was really hard for them. Of course it would be, you know, you uproot your entire life to move to Britain. So I think there wasn't necessarily confusion as such. I was very much just go with the flow, see how it is. And it wasn't until I think I was around 17, 18 that I really started to try and understand more about my identity, you know, how British am I? You know, I'm obviously still really Kenyan, you know, like this thing's not come off my wrist for decades. You know? Yeah, there we go. You know, I'm 26 now. I think I've had it on for most of my life. So I think it was only around that age, around when I started doing my A-levels, that kind of thing, when I started to think more, and I'd go back to Kenya and visit, and I'd think more about being Kenyan, but now also feeling quite British and almost feeling like I want to feel more British because this is home sort of as well now. You know, I also, you know, grew up most of my adolescence in Britain, so that's really formative, those years, right? But up until that point, I still never really considered India much. You know, I know we spoke Gujarati and stuff, but I never visited and I'd never been part of that culture really. Until I visited India later on, you know, in the last few years, and then I started to uncover more about my Indian identity that I hadn't,
What is your identity? What would you say?
I try and lump it all together.
Don't tell us, somebody else.
Yeah. East African Indian British, or British East African Indian, you know, and there's not a checkbox on a form where I can tick that, obviously, but anything less than that, it doesn't do justice. Yeah.
You're a child of 3 continents.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
But you know, you say you go back to Africa. When you go there, do people see you as foreign, or even in India?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Unfortunately, yes, I think they do now. You know, you're seen as a visitor. You know, you're not seen as coming back home. Although, I think for me, it does feel like going back home to Kenya. Um, but you know, I think because of the age I left, ultimately I was quite young. You know, I was quite young. So, and I've lived here more of my life than I did, you know, back there. So, I think obviously I still speak the language and I still feel very well integrated. Um, but you know, and I think where do I feel most at home? I think it's Britain now. And so I think from that perspective, perhaps there is that feeling of perhaps being a foreigner or being from abroad. Um, Maybe the word foreigner is a bit strong. I don't know, because I don't know if I'm a foreigner there because I'm born there. You know, I lived there for a lot of my life, so I don't know whether I'd say I'm a foreigner there. In India, yeah, I probably am a foreigner. You know, and I think when I visited India, I felt very much like I'm not from here, but I'm visiting. But equally, I am from here. I have such a rich history of being from here. Um, but I can't speak Hindi, and that's something I really wanted to be able to do. So, you know, I'm trying to learn Hindi now. But I think language is such a big part of it, you know, and I think that connects you with the people, the culture, the way of life so much more than anything else does. And I think that's being able to speak Swahili and being able to still, you know how to interact with that culture so much more than I can with the Indian culture in India. That makes me feel so much more at home, I think, there than it does in India.
You say you feel more at home here. Have you ever faced racism or not not felt as a one of them?
Mm. Yeah, you know, I think I definitely have. I've been lucky enough not to face sort of overt sort of racism, you know, name calling and that kind of slurs and that sort of thing. Thankfully, I've been lucky, and I think that's probably a result of where I've lived. I've lived in Birmingham and then in London, big cities, hugely multicultural. Of course, racism happens in these cities as well, but it's not as common, and it's probably not as overt as, you know, other places. So I've been lucky on that front. Of course, I think every migrant, every, you know, non-white person probably at some point in their life has experienced that sort of otherness, maybe that ostracizing, maybe that sense of, is that happened to me because of the color of my skin. And it's so hard to you know, to get down to it because you can't prove it. You know, you can't really be sure. You can't objectively say that's the reason I've had this experience. It's only a thought that you can have, and you can't really do much with it either. You know, you can think about it, but you can't really do much with it because these are just thoughts, and, you know, it's very easy to get sucked into them. I've certainly felt it, yeah, at points. As, you know, when I was new here, I think, you know, maybe I felt it at school. To some degree, but then again, my school was hugely multicultural by the end, so I didn't really feel it anymore. But yeah, I think perhaps maybe in my first few days in my workplace, not my current workplace, but, you know, in a working environment, perhaps I felt it to some degree. Maybe just sort of, you know, in politics, I felt it certainly, because politics can be quite a rough game sometimes. You know, it's not always the most inclusive and exciting, and it can be quite dirty. And I think I felt it in those environments more so. I also have to consider the fact that my name is quite a Muslim name. You know, I say my name and people immediately will have judgments about who I am, where I'm from. I'm not saying bad or good judgments, but you just make judgments about people based on what they tell you. So I'm a brown man. My name is Ali. It's a very Muslim name. And so, you know, you sort of have that, you have to deal with that, you know, when you're speaking to people who perhaps sometimes you'll meet people and you're aware that perhaps they're making judgments about me. You don't know whether those judgments are based on your race, background, religion, whatever. But sometimes you get a sense that, okay, maybe I've rubbed you up the wrong way or something, you know?
Does it bother you? Your name?
No, it doesn't. You know, my name, my parents are so proud of the name they gave me because we've got Imam Ali, right? And Shias, they've got such a close connection to Imam Ali, and I'm named after him, and I'm hugely proud of my name. There's such a rich history to it, and it, you know, there's, for our community, for our religion, it means so much. But I remember when I went to India, because you can't tell what religion, you know, I am. I'm not. There's nothing about me that would tell you that I'm of a certain religion until I tell you my name. And I remember in India, I was traveling on a train from Kerala to Bombay, hugely long journey, around 27 hours. And in India, you know, there's some aunties sat around in this carriage that we're in, and they're like looking at me, sort of, who's this guy? He's got a massive backpack. and I could see them quite curious about who I am and that kind of thing. And so the guy with chai comes on the train, you know, offering chai, and I was like, yeah, I'll have some. And then we have chai, and I, you know, we start to talk actually. And we're like, oh, like, you know, and they're like, where are you from? You know, where are you? The standard inquisitive auntie questioning that you get from them. And I said, yeah, I'm from the UK, but I'm actually Indian, and I'm visiting, sort of. And they started to talk to me a bit more about India and their experiences, and it got onto politics. And I love a political chat, so I love talking about Modi and, you know, stuff, the political scene in India. And they were telling me just how much they love Modi, and how much they love the BJP, and how great the BJP is, and all of this. And I was like, and you know, I've got my reservations about what the BJP believe in and that sort of thing. And so it was so fascinating. And then by the end of the journey, they asked, oh, like, what's your name, sort of thing. And I said, my name's Ali. And they were like, oh, okay. Of course, yeah. Almost this realization that, God, we've just been telling this, you know, this Muslim guy how much we love the BJP. And I was obviously, you know, I was counter arguing, you know, some of the Muslim experiences of the BJP and that kind of thing. And it was so fascinating. So I think it was that moment. And, you know, I didn't want them to worry, you know, I don't want people to have to feel like they have to guard themselves. And I kind of liked people not knowing, because it meant that they didn't hold back, kind of thing, you know, if at all they were going to. So yeah, it's interesting.
Do you like to talk about your community?
Yeah, I do. I certainly do. I think the East African Asian community, you know, there's such a rich history there, and it's not told enough. At a time right now where migrants are demonized so much, and there's, unfortunately, there's a perception of migration that is really so tainted, so negative, and you contrast that to the story of, you know, say, let's be specific, the Ugandan Asian experience of 1972 moving to Britain. I think there's around almost 30,000 of them who moved. There is so many lessons to be learned from that. We don't use it enough as a benchmark for what, you know, the migration story could look like. We just don't, and it's such a shame, because there's so many lessons to be learnt for the children of that, for the children of that community as well. We don't talk about it enough. We just don't, and I think it goes back to that point around that generation was so happy to suppress a lot of that, to just, you know, let it be, because it doesn't help us with integrating. It doesn't make us better British people to talk about how much the British oppressed us. And you know, I think now is the time to have that conversation, because that community has proven itself to be so, you know, and you shouldn't have to prove yourself to make this place your home, but that community has, you know, they've been hugely successful in politics, business, you know, the arts, whatever. And I think to be able to tell that story and to be able to talk about it openly, we can learn so much from it. We really, really can. Yeah.
Do you like to talk about your religious community as well?
Yeah, I do. I think perhaps.
Tell us.
Yeah, perhaps. I think that one is. Of course, I'm hugely proud of, you know, being a Khoja, which is what being from Kutch is, and I think our religious identity is so tied into being Khojas, with being from, you know, from Kutch and being from Gujarat, and so our community in Birmingham that I attend that religious community is so intertwined with being Indian and being Khoja that we almost conflate the two sometimes. I think we've got, you know, we've got the added struggle of we're Muslim, and I think there are huge connotations that people have with that, and we have the challenge of navigating that in our lives in Britain. Being Muslim it's not easy, I think, in this environment, you know, in the West at the moment, probably. And I don't want to sound like, you know, all soppy about it, because, you know, we're still proud of being Muslim, and, you know, but I think it's such a huge community with so many different perceptions of Islam. And I know I'm biased, and, you know, but I think what we did so well in East Africa is portray a really positive version of Islam that was so open, you know, that was so inclusive. We had friends who were, you know, from all sorts of backgrounds. It really didn't matter. And unfortunately, we've lost so much of that in this country with the community. And I think it's the Muslim community, also the wider East African Asian community. We don't have those bonds like we did back in Kenya or in Africa. You know, it really didn't matter where you came from. In Uganda, if you were Asian and you were all part of the same story. You all lived the same sort of life. You know, you'd go to the mandir and celebrate Diwali if you were Muslim, and you'd come to the mosque and commemorate Muharram if you were Hindu as well. You know, and there was loads of Hindus who you know, and Muharram is the commemoration of the death of the grandson of the Prophet, Imam Hussein, and it was still such a huge event for so many Hindus as well. I remember being in Mombasa during the 10th of Muharram, which is Ashura Day, which is the death anniversary of the Prophet's grandson, and there's a procession that goes around the town, and I remember so vividly this a group of Hindu ladies stood outside the mosque, just in so much awe of what they were seeing, you know, flooded with tears, just hugely appreciative of what they were seeing, which was a Shia Muslim commemoration of the death of the Prophet's grandson. But they were so involved and so, you know, invested in it. And equally, we were invested in the holidays and the festivities of the Hindu community. You know, we've been to mandirs and done garba and all of that sort of stuff, you know, dandiya and all of that. And it was such a big part of our upbringing there, but we've lost that. And I don't know how we get it back. It's so sad. I think the community there was smaller. It made it easier. Here, we've all siloed so much. And even within the Muslim community, we're siloed, you know. The Ismailis, the Thnashris, we are seen as so separate to some of the Sunni communities, you know, and there's so much friction there. We're so divided. It's almost like a nostalgia almost of what was in East Africa and how we managed to make it work so well.
So even your generation, Shias and Sunnis, even they have still that animosity?
Unfortunately, yes, I
Really?
think, yeah. And I remember just the stark contrast I saw when I first moved to Britain. And I moved to Birmingham, which is, you know, that's got a large Muslim population. And mind you, I'd come from Mombasa, right? I had Hindu friends, Ismaili friends, Ithnashri friends, Christian friends, white friends, black friends. Right? It was really so diverse. And I remember moving to Birmingham and not really thinking that my faith was controversial at all, right? Because it was so accepted and normal, you know, back home. And I moved to Birmingham. I went to a school which was actually a fairly inner city school. It was, you know, wasn't performing very well. There was, I'd moved here. I just needed to start schooling, right? There wasn't really, I didn't have the luxury of waiting and deciding to pick a school and all of this. So I just went to the one that I could get into. And I remember some boys there who asked me, you know, are you Shia? Because of my name. And I said, yeah, yes, I am. And that was my biggest regret, was telling them I was Shia, because I was then for the years really that followed, it was always like, oh, but you're different, right? Because you guys do this, and are you guys really Muslim? and there's this word thrown around, kuffar, which means disbeliever. Such a strong word, right? Such sort of ugly connotations to it. Never something I'd even heard of before. But these people were brainwashed. You grew up in such a monoculture in parts of Birmingham, unfortunately, which, we say Birmingham is multicultural and diverse, but it's not integrated at all. And that is one of the biggest challenges I think we face as a country, which we underestimate, is that, unfortunately, migration is beautiful. It should be celebrated. But if there is a failure for those communities to become part of the wider fabric, then it's a huge failure. And I say that because we also failed to do that to some degree in Kenya, right? And that's why we had challenges in our own ways. But you look here, and that sort of questioning, that understanding of, you are a disbeliever, you are so far away from my belief, that we were like 13, right? 12, 13, 14, we were in high school. But suddenly I felt like I had to start defending my faith, and I'd never thought about it like that. I was a kid. Like, you don't think about having to defend your faith. And eventually I just stopped engaging with the conversation altogether, because I didn't want to. And it's quite tough, for a kid. At the time I just sort of shrugged it off. It wasn't that big deal. But you think back to it, and I would talk to my parents about it, and they would be quite concerned about it as well. But yeah.
Just want to ask you, we talked about the colonial past. I mean, what is your attitude? What do you think of the colonial story, and do you feel that they teach enough in this country or make people aware of the colonial? You studied here in this country.
You know what, it's so funny because people talk about this. I didn't have any at all from year 8 onwards, which is when I moved to this country. No teaching of the colonial history at all, neither positive nor negative, almost not mentioned at all, which was so bizarre to me, right? Now, I came from Kenya, where we had spoken about the British all the time, right? Because we had been colonized by them. We had, we had taken in so much of their culture, their view of life, it was such an intrinsic part of our new identities as Kenyans. Whereas I came here and it wasn't talked about at all, right? It was only when I got to university that I started to look into it more, because I had that, intellectual freedom to do what I wanted. I started looking more into our story as East African Asians. And of course, that was hugely tainted by, our colonial past. And I still feel to this day that I don't know as much about it as I should. We only talk about the positive side of colonialism. I didn't talk about it at all. And I don't know if that experience is unique to me, but actually I think a lot of people, if you ask them about the colonial past, they won't really have much to say about it, positive or negative. It's just something that happened, and it's not really an opinion that they have, they hold an opinion about. So it's certainly something we need to talk about more. It needs to be built in, both sides. I remember talking to my the generations above me in my family, like my grandparents' generation and people of that sort of level, and they look back at it, and it's so interesting to hear the way they talk about it, because of course it was so tough for them, and you'd expect them to hold almost some level of discontent or resentment, but it's the opposite. They adore Britain, and I think that's another reason why that community has done so well for itself, is because they have a genuine adoration for Britain. And a lot of them look back and say, before we gained independence, things were so much better, in the sense of corruption in Africa wasn't an issue. It was systems ran more effectively. However, you've got to understand that they're saying that within the context of where they sat within that colonial past. They were privileged in many ways themselves, right? So ultimately, it wasn't England's country to rule, right? So of course, independence was a good thing. But when they talk about it, it's so fascinating that it's not negative. It's not a negative experience that they see. Of course, there are people who, Asians who were part of that freedom story and part of that, that history, but not in my family. And now I look at it, and of course it's so much more nuanced than that. And I look at it within the lens of being raised in Britain as well, of learning more about it from an educational standpoint at university, understanding that we were really privileged in our position there. And I think those nuances are not really acknowledged within the community that we're in, let alone the education system. I think that has a really long way to go, yeah.
You're calling Britain your home now.
Yeah.
Does it ever bother you that history could repeat itself and something like what happened in Uganda could happen here, and where would you go?
Yeah. You know what, people have say that to me, yeah. To be honest with you, it doesn't frighten me. That doesn't seem like a realistic outcome. I cannot see a world where you know, Britain says to the Asians to get, I just can't see it. Maybe I'm being naive and overly optimistic, but I just feel in a country, you know, I'd say in the US is a different story, right? But in this country where we've had, you know, an Indian prime minister, and, you know, where we've made such great strides compared to the other parts of the Western world, and of course we've got our challenges, I just don't see a reality where, you know, people, any community are told, get up and get out, and there's no space for you, and you've only got this much time. And I know maybe the ways that it would happen, if it was to happen now, would be more systematic. It would be slightly more nuanced, almost like a phasing out of a certain type of people. It's not something I worry about particularly because I just don't see it happening. You know, and I think the other reason is because, and again, I caveat this with perhaps there's an element of naivety here, right? But I feel very much at home here, right? I don't know whether it's because London, Birmingham, these places are hugely diverse. I don't feel out of place. And I think it's so important to feel not out of place. You know, I can go on the tube, I can go into a pub, I can go to work, and I still will not feel out of place, right? There was a time probably I did, realistically. I think there was. Of course, there are environments where I do think, okay, yeah, I am the only brown person here. And you're aware, there is an awareness of the fact that there are hugely white spaces, and, you know, you perhaps are, you know, you're not white, and you have an awareness of that. But I don't think that takes away from your sense of belonging in this country. You know, you've got to balance all these different parts of your identity, right? I would be it would be sort of, I wouldn't be true to myself if I didn't maintain all parts of my identities. Being Muslim, being Shia, these are as important parts as being, you know, Indian, East African, British. Like, all of these parts form who I am. So to say one, you know, becomes stronger than the other is unfair, I think. It's unfair to myself. It's not a true reflection of who I am. And it's down to me to sort of have that understanding of the various parts of my identity, the various nuances, but also to accept them all, right? It would be wrong for me to push some away and to try and be more one than the other. And I can, of course, there are parts that maybe I relate to more in my day-to-day life, in the sense of, you know, where I work, how I live, what I do. You know, so much of that is British, but so much of my view of life and understanding is Muslim, and is based on my understanding of religion and God, and, you know, so those parts are as important. And so, you know, you mentioned the mosque and, you know, religious practices and rituals. That has always been part of my life. Like, from as far as I can remember in Kenya, you know, going to the mosque, being part of that community. So I don't think that will ever feel unnatural to me. You know, I will always perhaps be cognizant and aware that some of this is so different to other parts of my life, but actually it's still part of my life. It's still part of who I am. That will never change.
Just want to talk a bit about your wishes and your expectations of what should change in society from what you are talking now. And would you like people to obviously, like, you know, accept Muslim boy or... Yeah. I think it's such a tough question, isn't it? There's so much to it. I think the one thing I just wish people would understand is just how different our communities are. You know,
the East African Asian community, I think, is so unique in so many ways to other communities, and other communities are unique in their own ways. But often, when we're having these policy discussions and we're talking about immigration and diversity, we're lumped together so much as communities, and I just wish there's a greater understanding of our histories, where we come from, why we are the way we are. Not enough people understand our background because they don't know about our history, right? Because why would they? We don't talk about it. Well, like we do, but we as a country don't talk about our histories very well. It's not part of our education system. So I just wish there was a greater awareness about that, and the nuances of it. I think the thing that worries me the most is the direction that we're headed in as a country when it comes to migrant communities and diversity. Because it's all well and good, saying, yes, we need to all, we need to all live together and we need to make this work, and we absolutely should be, being a compassionate country who takes in refugees, who takes in migrants, because we were recipients of that, so we must be supporters of it. But there is a responsibility on government, on policymakers, on migrant communities as well, right? We don't talk about it enough, and on societies that they move into. All of those groups have a responsibility to make it work. And unfortunately, I don't think any of those groups really, in today's day and age, are really pulling their weight when it comes to that, right? There is no strategy for integration that the government has that is solid, that really supports migrant communities once they move to Britain to actually integrate positively. They just, people come in and then that's it, right? Where are we talking about, British culture, language, history, right? This is our culture, right? So if we're going to maintain some element of shared identity, right, which I think is so important as a country, otherwise we just fragment completely. If we're to maintain that, there has to be some sort of policy-led discussion around how migrant communities create a sense of belonging in Britain, because there isn't. The second is on migrant communities as well. Unfortunately, they don't feel the need to do it, I think, in the way that I think sort of, say, the Ugandan Asians did, because they had no choice but to, right? This had to be home for them because they had no other option. A lot of other communities have an option to go back. So, but that's fine, right? If you've got the option to go back, that's great. But actually, there's no longer an understanding, I think, that you have to give to the country as much as you take from it. And I think that's something that I'm so proud of, East African Asians, in the sense of they had a real sense of social responsibility to their communities, to their neighborhoods, right? And you see that in the way that they are, in the careers that they've gone into, in the stories that they tell, and in the way that the community is now portrayed, right? That sense of social responsibility, that's going away, unfortunately, I feel, and that is so important. So we need to be talking about that more. And then also, as always, the society in Britain, the communities that they're moving into, they've always had a responsibility to make people feel welcome, to give them a chance, right? To include them in, invite them to, your village do's and your pubs, and, invite them to attend these events and, your street fairs, and create an environment where people feel like they want to be part of that community. And again, that's not happening either. So I'm quite worried about the trajectory of the country, the social dynamic, because what it means is that people will continue to make judgments, continue to divide themselves, and then you don't get the opportunity really anymore for people to become part of one identity, right? Which we still can be. There has to be a common denominating factor that ties everyone together, regardless of what background you're from, what your religion is. There has to be an identity that brings us all together. Right now, that is really at risk, I think.